Welcome back, everybody, to All Church Sunday School. Glad to have you with us again. Here's my friend, Jamie Plunkett.
Hello. Should I look at you? Should I look over here? Hello.
Hello to our class.
Hello.
This class has been together for a while. And if this is your first time with the class, you are so welcome. Mm-hmm. We are making our way through the Gospel of Mark. We are focused on chapter 7 today.
Yes.
Correct?
And
but we're actually
6.
going to pick up a little bit of the end of 6. But we're glad you're here. We hope that if you love Sunday school, this digital ministry gives you a little flavor of that. We're missing it very much. And if you never thought you were a Sunday school person, we hope you'll just be curious enough to hang in there for this conversation as we work through the gospel and lots of other interesting details. Mm-hmm. I'm having a good time.
It's been a blast. I want to give a special shout out this week to Sandra Soria for sending me an image of John the Baptist's head on a platter. Thank you. Been asking for like a month, so thank you for that.
She found it. Sandra. There it was. And we had in chapter 6 last week, just to remind everybody, there's just a detour that the writer of Mark takes in the middle of chapter 6 to explain what happened to John the Baptist. And so we were curious about how someone might illustrate that, but we didn't include it in this recording.
It was pretty gruesome.
Because it's kind of gruesome.
It's pretty gross, but it was fun to see.
But it was fun to see.
So if you want to see it, I have it now. I can send it to you if you'd like it.
Just reach out. We'll give you an email address at the end. Just reach out directly to Jamie. We also heard back after our discussion of John the Baptist. We heard back from our consultant on all things theatrical, Dr. Harry Parker. He knew right off the top of his head just exactly who on stage told that story of the end of John the Baptist. And so we have some slides to show you. First of all, Oscar Wilde in 1891 wrote a play about Salome and very...
a tragedy in one act.
A tragedy in one act, and that is where the Dance of the Seven Veils comes from, is Oscar Wilde's play. He's a very interesting-looking fellow, isn't he?
That's a big pinky ring.
He's just dramatic. That's all I have to say.
That had to be like a cultural thing at the time.
I have to tell you that the illustrator of the Salome piece also drew a picture of The Dancer's Reward, I think was the name of it. And it also was John the Baptist's head on a platter. So nice. Another place that you can find it. Solid. And Harry also reminded us that in 1927, Philip Berry produced produced a play, John, that includes the scene that we're talking about, the end of John the Baptist's life. It's a play in 5 acts, and it, according to Harry, was a major flop. But you will know Philip Berry because he's the one who wrote the Philadelphia story. Everybody knows that classic.
Totally.
So the story of John the Baptist, not so good. Philadelphia story, great.
This is confession time. Jamie's confession time.
You haven't watched Philadelphia Story.
I have not seen the Philadelphia Story. I saw this slide in our slide deck for today, and so I Googled the Philadelphia Story, and now I feel like I've basically seen it.
So Harry said in his email that...
Which is probably, I'm sorry, that's probably super insulting to Harry Parker, and I apologize, Harry.
Well, he'll have to deal with you directly on that. I'm somewhat disappointed in you, but Harry, please get in touch with Jamie about this atrocity that he has just revealed. So that just was a great, interesting story to playwrights and to movie makers, and... for obvious reasons, it felt a lot like an interruption to me in the plot of chapter 6 to stop and go, wait a minute, and almost do a flashback to say, here's what happened to John the Baptist.
Absolutely.
But it was a good opportunity for us to talk about John the Baptist again.
It was.
And his role and his ministry.
I had really only kind of been focused on like the artistic renderings from, paint and canvas and kind of that medium. But I really did appreciate Harry bringing us into a different way of reenacting and telling that story on stage, which I thought was really cool.
Now we're going to look at art for, we begin today with Jesus walking on water, the very end of chapter 6. I hope you have your Bible there in front of you, and you can look with us at I think I got my pages out of order.
Uh-oh.
But I'll fix that right away. Here we go. And thanks again to our fabulous artistic expert, Orlu Lager, for finding some very interesting pictures for us. Take a look at this first one, Jesus walking on water. This is by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. He's Italian. Mm-hmm. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Towards the end of the 18th century. What do you think when you see this piece of art?
Well, I think back to, and this is something that I thought of in all of these pictures, was I think back to that image that you have shown us a couple times now of the first century boat that they actually unearthed.
Mm-hmm. The Jesus boat.
The Jesus boat. And I see all of these boats, and they're much sturdier in appearance than that boat would have been. Well, that's
because that was 2,000 years old that it looked like that.
You never know. You don't know that. I don't know that. But anyways, I look at this photo, though, and I see just kind of
Not a photo.
Sorry, this painting. And I'm doing great today. I'm really just hitting home runs left and right. But I look at this painting, and it just is chaotic. You know, there's a lot happening.
You can feel the wind, don't you think?
You can feel that this boat is maybe rocking back and forth a little bit. So you see someone kind of hanging over the edge of the boat. Someone standing up in the back of the boat, and it's leaning on its side. The sail is not upright at all. This is a chaotic moment, and there is Jesus standing in the foreground on the right, just very still, very upright, kind of reaching out, looking like he's giving some instruction. And so this whole painting is just chaos, and then the stillness of Jesus in that moment. Kind of calming presence.
I think it's really this particular composition has Jesus so much closer to the boat. I think we'll see in other paintings Jesus coming towards them, but this is Jesus having arrived, and we're going to read those words in just a minute. Orlu says this is 18th century Rococo style, and the artist painted this not long before he died. But it really is this, almost seems animated to me. Mm-hmm. It almost really feels like there's movement in that. All right, look at this next one. Gustave Doré, Jesus walking on water. And this actually comes from a French illustrated Bible, 1866. So it's interesting when you look for art representing stories in the Bible that you do see a lot of Bible illustrations, and some of them are not so good. But this is just amazing. Mm-hmm. And this is one, Orlu found that this is one of the few classic works, 1866, that doesn't feature Peter.
Oh, well, neither does our story this morning. So that's
right. So not all of the telling of that Jesus walking on the water includes Peter getting out of the boat. This particular artist, one of the most successful 19th century illustrators, exuberant romantic work, famous for illustrating Dante's Divine Comedy. That's an interesting tidbit.
Yeah.
So this looks like the boat's going down, don't you think?
It's definitely got that Titanic feel.
That looks like a bigger
One end is
boat
much higher than the other.
Bigger than the Jesus boat.
Mm-hmm. It's a big boat. I think of this scene as many times as I've read this story, and it's almost like the chaos that is close, and then you kind of off in the distance. That kind of really iconic scene in so many movies where it's like someone kind of reaching the crest of a hill off in the distance, and there's like the haze from the sun and the heat coming out, and this is like blurry, and then all of a sudden they get to a distance where they break in and you can see who it is. It's kind of the big reveal. And I kind of imagine Jesus like walking across the lake like this, and all of, like they see in the distance, and then all of a sudden oh, it's Jesus, and
then everybody
then
screams.
panic
So
ensues.
we'll find out.
Yeah.
That causes everybody to
Right.
scream. All right, look at this next one. A Russian, say the last name for me. You're really good at that.
Ayvazovsky?
That's very good.
Ayvazovsky?
Was born in the Ukraine of Russian and Armenian parents. And this painting goes back to 1888. He also was a romantic artist and produced rather melodramatic depictions of religious themes. So what do you see in this one that you want to... if I saw that Jesus, I would scream. That's paranormal activity.
Yeah, this is glowing ghost Jesus. This is not
is scary.
human Jesus.
Yes.
And
of course, Peter's in this one. Peter's making his way to Jesus.
just getting over that little wave and making his way out there. Peter's obviously figured it out, because at the beginning of the story, Peter starts to sink and then he panics again. But in this depiction, it looks like Peter has figured out the walking on the water part of things.
This artist is so famous that a lot of his pieces became stamps.
Interesting.
Postage stamps. I don't know if this one in particular did. I'd like to have this stamp. Wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. But this is a whole different approach. And now one more that I want you to see. And this one is from a Korean artist. I don't know that we have the name of this Korean artist, so we've just sort of featured the blog spot where this painting came from. But what do you think about this one? Of course, this also has features Peter.
Yeah, this is the Peter that I remember from the story.
And there's you can see a little bit of the boat up in the top portion of the painting, but I like the movement of the water.
Yes.
I like the fact that they both have hats on.
Yes.
Jesus represented as holy.
It's very culturally appropriate, I believe, for who painted it. And I love the comment from this site as well.
Why don't you read that to us?
Sure. Kind of this idea, if Jesus had been Korean. Jesus was thoroughly Jewish. Even so, different cultures and ethnicities have often portrayed Jesus and others from the Bible as being from their group. Sometimes this is done to symbolize the fact that Jesus came for all the nations of the world. Since Christianity for many centuries was based largely in Europe, these important characters of salvation history have often been depicted as white Europeans, which is fine, but other cultures have also depicted them according to their own appearances.
Let's take a look at that picture one more time. I love that. I'm so happy to see the breadth of artists, contemporary and classic, all around the world, telling this story.
I appreciate it for a variety of reasons. One of which is I think that the more we practice talking about Jesus and generally just talking about God in different ways and represented in different ways, the broader our understanding of who God is becomes. It would be very narrow, I think, for us to only consider God in certain ways and Jesus in certain ways and as doing certain things. And so even through art, this is one of those opportunities to really just kind of expand how we think about who God is. In similar fashion to, thinking about Hamilton, the recent, not terribly recent now, but the Broadway production of Hamilton, where all of these white men were represented by people of color in this beautiful musical. And it's just, it's really cool to see those boundaries kind of blurred a little bit. Things aren't
very
so rigid anymore, which
agree.
I appreciate.
Well, we should, now that we've looked at these amazing illustrations, listen to the story.
Let's do it.
Will you share it with us?
Yes.
We're at the very end of Mark 6.
This comes from Mark chapter 6, verses 47 through 56. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and Jesus was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, Jesus came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
So we conclude chapter 6 with Jesus struggling once again against the growing fame that follows him everywhere. But I want to rewind just to the end of the walking on the water story and the sentence, "And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves."
Yes.
Which it seems like such a strange sentence, doesn't it? Even as you read it. And then hearts were hardened, which makes me think of Pharaoh and Moses, you know, this idea that that there was a force keeping the disciples from the discernment that was so important to what was going to happen in their lives. But I thought you would be interested in this comment that I found, and I would be interested in your reaction.
Okay.
Throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus is an enigma to his disciples. He is the ultimate riddle of Mark's story, the embodiment of a parable. The disciples never seem to have much insight about him, who he is. In this story, the disciples do not understand that Jesus himself is the metaphorical key to the feeding miracle, which we read about last week. Jesus is the bread of life, sitting in the boat with them. What do you think?
I love that. It feels out of context to read that they did not understand about the loaves this week. But if you were here with us last week, you know that we just talked about the feeding of the 5,000.
That's right.
So
that's the story that precedes.
This boat story happens right after the feeding of the 5,000.
They're still scratching their heads about.
And so they've probably
where did all
not
that
had
food come
a ton
from?
of time to process that they stole a child's lunch and then fed 5,000 people with it. Not the boy's not in this version.
You're still carrying a grudge on
I'm
that
not carrying
one.
a grudge on that. I just think they could have gotten bread other places. But
the action is moving so fast in Mark's gospel.
Yes.
That as they take a moment to ponder what was going on, another thing, they're still back one miracle earlier, not quite understanding, maybe until after Jesus is resurrected, not even understanding until then.
Yeah.
They're still worried about where did all that extra bread come from?
Yeah, I think that one of I can only imagine that if these stories had actually happened back to back to back to back to back like this, which we've talked about telescoping in Mark before and just how the whole telling of the story feels a little bit sped up. But even in this moment where they're on a boat and they maybe have a chance to take a deep breath, because in other parts of this gospel and other gospels, we see Jesus get in a boat, and that's a moment of rest. It's a moment of retreat, regrouping. And so they're in the boat. Maybe there's a chance for that. And no, there's no chance for that. Here comes Jesus walking on the water, glowing, as we've seen in some of our images this morning. And just one thing after another, it becomes too much. Like your brain just gets overloaded and can't process all of these things. So it's no wonder to me that the disciples are having a hard time figuring out how to unlock the stories, to unlock Jesus as this ultimate kind of parable. I love that kind of wording that Paul Walaske.
That's probably it.
Sure. Paul gives us from Feasting on the Gospels here, that Jesus is the key to the feeding miracle. Jesus is the key to all of the healing miracles. Jesus is the key to the wind calming down and walking out on the water and getting into the boat. Jesus is the key to all of this other unexplainable
The centrality
stuff.
of Jesus maybe is the one lesson they still have not learned.
Because, and I think it comes from that line that Paul writes, the disciples never seem to have much insight about him, who he is. They're always having this debate. Everybody in the Gospel of Mark is having this debate about who Jesus actually is. And until they unlock
the inner circle and those on the outside and the critics, everybody's debating it.
But until they unlock that, understanding Jesus' true identity, they're going to struggle with everything else that he's doing.
Yes.
It is kind of the final puzzle piece
that is
they're still missing.
That's a good comment.
Thank you.
Excellent comment on your part. Now, we're going to start into 7, and we're going to switch to a translation, contemporary English translation, just to try a different... I think that both of us would say that looking at different translations is just part of the fun of Bible study.
Of course.
And finding how people described, good translations can really give a different perspective. So this is contemporary English translation. But I want to remind everybody before Jamie starts reading into the tradition of the elders, what we talked about in our introduction to Mark 8, 9, 10 weeks ago. We talked about who it was that wrote the Gospel of Mark, and that scholars believe that the writer of Mark is presuming that readers will be unfamiliar with Jewish customs.
Yes.
When you see Mark explaining something, that's part of the detective work about his audience and Mark's perspective. Mark also explains Aramaic terms, assuming that his readers don't know that, and geography, assuming that his readers are not familiar with the area around the Sea of Galilee. And so the scholars suggest that he is writing from perhaps Syria or Italy or elsewhere within the Roman Empire. He's writing from a distance. And you will notice as we talk about the elders and the tradition of the elders, that Mark stops to explain.
Yes.
Here's why that happens. Here's why. So in this particular case, Mark's assuming that he is writing to a reader who is not familiar with Jewish customs.
Yes, that's important. That's very important information. I think we spend a lot of time looking at Scripture and trying to gain information and understanding and wisdom about what it means to us. But if we neglect who the first readers of a text are, we're missing a part of the picture of what this is really talking about and who this is talking to.
All right, you're going to read the
yes
next scene.
Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. Some Pharisees and several teachers of the law of Moses from Jerusalem came and gathered around Jesus. They noticed that some of his disciples ate without first washing their hands. The Pharisees and many other Jewish people obey the teachings of the ancestors. They always wash their hands in the proper way before eating. None of them will eat anything they buy in the market until it is washed. They also follow a lot of other teachings, such as washing cups, pitchers, and bowls. The Pharisees and teachers asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples obey what our ancestors taught us to do? Why do they eat without washing their hands?" Jesus replied, "You are nothing but show-offs. The prophet Isaiah was right when he wrote that God had said, 'All of you praise me with your words, but you never really think about me. It is useless for you to worship me when you teach rules made up by humans.'" Then Jesus said to them, "You disobey God's commands in order to obey what humans have taught. You are good at rejecting God's commands so that you can follow your own teachings. Didn't Moses command you to respect your father and mother? Didn't he tell you to put to death all who curse their parents? But you let people get by without helping their parents when they should. You let them say that what they own has been offered to God. You won't let those people help their parents. And you ignore God's commands in order to follow your own teaching. You do a lot of other things that are just as bad." Jesus called the crowd together again and said, "Pay attention and try to understand what I mean. The food that you put into your mouth does not make you unclean and unfit to worship God. The bad words that come out of your mouth are what make you unclean." After Jesus and his disciples had left the crowd and had gone into the house, they asked him what these sayings meant. And he answered, "Don't you know what I am talking about by now? You surely know that the food you put into your mouth cannot make you unclean. It doesn't go into your heart, but into your stomach, and then out of your body. By saying this, Jesus meant that all foods were fit to eat. Then Jesus said, "What comes from your heart is what makes you unclean. Out of your heart come evil thoughts, vulgar deeds, stealing, murder, unfaithfulness in marriage, greed, meanness, deceit, indecency, envy, insults, pride, and foolishness. All of these come from your heart, and they are what make you unfit to worship God."
He told him
It's pretty clear cut.
straightforward, and it really is a lecture about hypocrisy.
Yes.
Do you think, in a way?
I think so.
Especially making up your own rules, following your own rules rather than and claiming that they come from God. But no, you're ignoring God's teaching, and you've made up your own rules here.
And part of what I think is important to know is, especially, I think what Mark is trying to do for this original audience who doesn't understand Jewish culture is that this list of laws is so long and so complex that they had to have a designated body of people who went around and helped other people remember all of the laws and follow all of the laws. And so this group of people is doing what they feel is appropriate for their faith tradition. Mm-hmm. And they're naming to other people who are in their faith tradition, hey, remember, like, you're supposed to wash your hands, you're supposed to wash all of this stuff. You got to wash the food before you eat it, because otherwise it's unclean and it makes you unclean. And Jesus has no time for this whatsoever, which I appreciate because I like bacon a lot. Shout out to bacon. Shout out to Karen Parker for your bacon email earlier this week as well. It's just going to have a bacon. It should put a counter right here for how frequently I talk about bacon.
Are you part of the bacon lobby?
I was a Bacon of the Month Club member for a while. Anyways. But what Jesus is reminding...
But you digress.
I digress. But what Jesus is reminding this group of people, and then calling a larger crowd together to teach about, and then after he's done it twice, explaining once again to his disciples what he meant, because they're still confused after hearing it for 2 times now, is that it's about what is in your heart and how that comes out of you. That's what either makes you clean or unclean, fit or unfit to worship God. It has nothing to do with the food that we put in our body.
Reality, a much deeper reality.
Exactly.
I love this more contemporary translation because it has Jesus saying, pay attention and try to understand what I mean.
I will speak
slowly.
Try
your best to understand this.
If you need me to speak slowly, yes.
So if we're talking about hypocrisy, don't you think that we live in a very interesting time for everybody calling everybody else a hypocrite because of our fault line, right? Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think.
I've been hearing that word being thrown around quite a bit in the U.S.
I think that it's really easy to be a hypocrite these days when everyone seems so busy calling other people out on their actions. If you're going to set a moral standard, you have to meet it. And the more that we talk about higher moral standards and a higher ethical plane, the more opportunity we're going to have to not achieve that or live up to that.
And of course, social media makes calling people out so easy, right?
Yes, it really does.
So easy and rather public. It gives you a platform. Mm-hmm. So I thought you would be interested, as we move on to the next part of Scripture, to see 2 comments about hypocrisy from famous people.
Yes.
The first one comes from John Milton. I really think this is superb. For neither man nor angel can discern hypocrisy. It is the only evil that walks invisible except to God alone. Isn't that is just, it may be the one thing that only God knows who is really being a hypocrite. Do you agree? Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I kind of want to...
You're disagreeing with John Milton?
Yeah, he's a human being, right? He's not right all the time. Neither am I. So
you think we can...
I think that those who we know incredibly well and intimately and closely, we can start to really kind of feel out.
But I think that we mistake reading about somebody with knowing someone. Yes.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
you and I could say, doesn't that seem a little hypocritical?
Yes.
We know each other.
Yeah.
But
if we're looking, sure, like if we're looking at
to be known from the inside out
yeah,
is probably more. God is more capable of knowing where our heart is, which is kind of what we were talking about in the lecture Jesus gave to the Pharisees.
True. Yes, I think in that sense, John Milton is correct. I think, though, there are moments where even in our own kind of fallibility and finitude, we have the capability to say to those close to us and dear to us, like, maybe not.
You're going to say maybe not. You're not going to say you are
like,
a hypocrite.
Hey, think about what you're doing.
I don't know, Jamie.
I don't know.
Maybe you would like these words better from the great revivalist Billy Sunday.
Okie dokie.
Here's what he said about hypocrites in the church. Don't go hunt through the church for a hypocrite. Go home and look in the glass, meaning mirror.
I agree with that. I'm not saying like I'm not pushing back on John Milton because I've got like my fedora on, my Sherlock Holmes hat, and my magnifying glass, and I'm out here wandering around looking for hypocrites. I agree with Billy Sunday. I think that it's kind of like the check the log in your own eye first passage, where let's make sure that. Again, if we're going to set a certain level of moral and ethical standards, then let's make sure that we meet those. And let's just worry about our own selves rather than bothering about.
So Jesus, speaking up in the passage we just read, his disciples were being called out for not washing their hands. And it took him to a deeper place to say, hold on a minute, let's talk about this.
Yes.
Let's talk about what can seem kind of habitual and superficial, and where our hearts are. And I'm just going to give you, after we're through recording this John Milton poster so that you can live with it for a while.
I'll put it on my wall.
The blasphemy of not believing John Milton. All right, let's move on. Here we go. Now this is a very troubling episode coming now.
This is a tough one.
This is hard. All right. Read us this next hard passage.
Yes, this comes from Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. So it picks up right where we just left off. Jesus left and went to the region near the city of Tyre, where he stayed in someone's home. He did not want people to know he was there, but they found out anyway. A woman whose daughter had an evil spirit in her heard where Jesus was, and right away she came and knelt down at his feet. The woman was Greek and had been born in the part of Syria known as Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to force the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said, "The children must first be fed. It isn't right to take away their food and feed it to the dogs." The woman replied, "Lord, even dogs eat the crumbs that children drop from the table." And Jesus answered, "That's true. You may go now. The demon has left your daughter." And when the woman got back home, she found her child lying on the bed. The demon had gone.
Jesus seems so dismissive in those words. But let me just, before you and I talk about it, look at this comment from Feasting on the Gospels. Whenever this passage is read, people wince, sometimes even gasp, as they hear Jesus' remarks. In this scene, without even touching or seeing the little girl with the demon, Jesus heals her. His power is staggering. This is his most astonishing miracle thus far, and yet it is often overlooked. Jesus' power can be hard to see because of what we hear. Anyone in that house in Tyre would not wince or gasp when they heard this Jewish teacher speak in this way to this woman. She is a Gentile. Centuries of bad blood and probably a social caste or two lie between this woman and her Jewish neighbors. So when Jesus speaks this way, he is standing squarely alongside the Jewish peasants. His instincts are to protect the poor and the weak. What is more, when Jesus answers this woman in this way, he's sticking with God's agenda. Salvation would come first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. He is implementing a policy as if to say, their time will come. Does that satisfy you?
No.
That explanation?
Not really.
You expect Jesus to be above the bad blood between the Gentiles and the Jews.
Yeah.
That Jesus is better than that. Come on,
Yeah.
Jesus.
Like, I don't know. This is one of the toughest stories for me because I see this Greek woman who, first of all, if we think about the larger context of Mark, we already know how Jesus's first encounter with a Gentile group goes.
Right.
He gets over there. He runs these demons out of town,
Into pigs.
avoiding another bacon reference. And they reject him. They're afraid of him. They don't really kind of understand. They're more comfortable with the demon-infested man than they are with Jesus removing the demons.
And they look to him and say, "Are you about to leave? Could you leave now?
Maybe go." And so Jesus commissions the guy who he just saved to go and talk about what God has done. And so I wonder if those words made their way to this woman's ears, and now she has an idea of, well, he did it for this guy. Maybe he can help my daughter too.
And she's being very humble. And she's kneeling.
And she travels and she gets to where he is. She finds out, even though he is trying to stay under the radar, which is impossible for Jesus at this point. And he calls her a dog and says that it's not your time. You don't get to wait in line yet. You're not, one of the first people to get this vaccine. You're down the list a ways.
I can see him standing squarely alongside Jewish peasants, being protective that it's still their time.
Yeah.
With the master. But you're right. The words.
I have a hard time thinking that Jesus can't do both. Does it really impact the Jewish peasants for him to remove this demon? And ultimately he does do both. And
she is healed.
Maybe there's this just real clear moment of humanity. We talk about Jesus as fully divine and fully human, and maybe the humanness in Jesus got caught up in this bad blood.
And maybe later he thought, he shouldn't have said that.
And then
do you think Jesus ever regretted, because he is fully human and fully divine, ever regretted something that he said?
I don't know. We see him, we'll get there later in the Gospel of Mark, but we see him have this real struggle with what he's supposed to be doing right before the crucifixion, And so there's definitely this wrestling that's happening inside of him.
I think that she is, I think that what strikes me as well in this story is her response to him.
Yeah. She checks him immediately.
Even the dogs get the crumbs. Just give me the crumbs. Mm-hmm. I'll be satisfied with the crumbs for now.
There seems to be kind of a rhythm to that, even in the gospel. The bleeding woman. She's like, if I could just touch his cloak,
I won't
I'll be
ask
good.
for
I don't
a full-on
need
miracle.
Extravagant things. I just need to touch the cloak. I just need crumbs from the table. It's almost this signal that we don't need everything, like the full power of everything every moment. We just need to touch the cloak. We just need the crumbs from the table, and that will be sufficient because Jesus is tending to so many and so much that just this is enough.
Do you think perhaps there's telescoping by Mark in this story, and there was a longer conversation? And that's couldn't you kind of hope that Mark remembered the whole dogs and crumbs, and Jesus then ministered to her and let her know her daughter had been healed? I don't know.
I think
we can only have what we have.
We only have what we have. I think the telescoping happens between these stories more than it happens in the middle of them, because it seems less important to the author of Mark that we know what's happening as Jesus travels. But it's all right. He's done this, and then he went there, and now this is happening, and he went there, and now this is happening.
Yeah, you're right.
In the Gospel of Luke, it's almost opposite, where the traveling and the eating of the meals,
it's the timeline,
and the timeline that's all super important. And Mark, that's not what we're here to talk about.
All right, one more story, and we're done with chapter 7. There's been a lot in it. A healing story.
Yes, Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. So again, the first sentence, or the first two sentences talk about his travel, which is probably days, if not a week of travel. And then it's out of the way. Jesus left the region around Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward Lake Galilee. He went through the land near the 10 cities known as Decapolis. We've heard that city before, right? That's where he sent the healed man who had legion. He sent him to Decapolis. Some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. They begged Jesus just to touch him. Just a crumb. If I could just touch his cloak. Just touch him, Jesus. After Jesus had taken him aside from the crowd, he stuck his fingers in the man's ears. Then he spit and put it on the man's tongue. Jesus looked up toward heaven, and with a groan he said, "Ephphatha," which means open up. At once the man could hear, and he had no more trouble talking clearly. Jesus told the people not to say anything about what he had done. But the more he told them, the more they talked about it. I would too. Spit in my friend's face and he can talk all of a sudden. They were completely amazed and said, everything he does is good. He even heals people who cannot hear or talk.
So we have an Aramaic expression word in that particular passage that the writer of Mark takes the time to translate for us, which is one of the other things that's unique to the Gospel of Mark. What do you think about this healing story?
Jesus heals people in a variety of ways. He gets very creative with how he heals, how he disposes of demons, all of this other, we've just come from this really powerful healing where he didn't even see the girl. He
never
healed.
saw her.
And here in this moment, he physically touches the point of issue on this man who is deaf, sticking his fingers in his ears, and then spits on the man's tongue, which is another point of healing that needs to happen. I will be honest, I think of like Larry, Curly, and Moe when I think of this, just like the slap stick kind of poking. But I think this really just, Jesus is going to do whatever Jesus needs to do to heal the people that he comes across.
What do you think about Jesus taking him aside? Mark gives us that detail.
Well, it goes hand in hand with the line that he mutters right afterwards, "Don't tell anyone what I've done." Now,
part of that secrecy that is also
kind of reserved secret side of
the Gospel of Mark, definitely. Also, for someone struggling as this man was, just some a less hectic scene. Yeah. Not people bumping up against you.
This is true.
So that you can focus on what's going on.
That and maybe the I don't know, this guy can't hear. And maybe coming to that sense in a crowd of people wouldn't be the most welcoming first auditory experience. And so maybe pulling this guy off to the side was like an extra level of grace to say, I'm going to do this. And also, I want you to be in a setting that is maybe more welcoming to you being able to hear sound for the first time.
So this particular healing story makes one of the writers for Mark commentaries talk about how it is that how the narratives work for Jesus, the healing narratives. Mm-hmm. And they found 3 insights. See what you think about these. Number 1, in all of these stories, Jesus does not stigmatize persons with illnesses, diseases, impairments. He enters into their presence, disregarding purity codes, seeking their good. In this story, Jesus does not flinch at the man's inability to hear or regard it as a sign of sin or impurity. So Jesus enters into that person's space and life and reality. Number 2, Jesus' act of healing does not simply restore physical abilities, it restores community. And we've talked about that before.
Absolutely.
In this story, the man moves from an isolated he, in verse 35, to being part of they who proclaim the good news in 36. I like the way that's put. And here's the third insight. The healing narratives are not primarily about curing, which is the restoration of physical function, but about healing, which is a restoration of wholeness, a gift of abundant life. This healing points not to the one who healed, not to the one who was healed, but to the healer himself, who makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak.
I think it's interesting that the people in this story focus on he can even make people hear and speak again. Some of you probably saw him drive a literal demon into the ocean, and this is the impressive thing. I love the insight here about wholeness versus just physical healing, and it's something that, like it pairs really well with that restoring community thought that we've discussed before, about how when we kind of come back from whatever is restricting us from community, it is healing both for us and for the community in a manner that, when a family is missing something or someone, and then that person comes back, there is this kind of communal, celebratory, whole feeling. It's almost kind of sigh of relief of everything is as it should be now. And so that's the work that Jesus is really doing all across these stories, is he's restoring this kind of, this is how it should be, not the pain and the suffering, the blindness and the demonic possession and the broken, fractured communities that are hurting and don't understand why. This is how it should be. This wholeness, this celebratory community that cares for one another, that is right with one another. This is what it should look like, not that other
And when I think
reality.
of our modern plague of isolation, which existed long before the pandemic, but has been maybe more visible because of the pandemic, for Jesus always to be putting people back in community, and for us to live in a culture that allows people to be very isolated, to maybe never even have a healthy experience of community, and to not know what is missing. And it really makes me feel a sense of urgency for the work of the church where isolation is concerned.
Oh, absolutely.
That kind of healing is needed in our world today.
I agree wholeheartedly. Some of the folks that we've been most worried about during the pandemic are the people who are alone. And especially last week in the middle of the winter storm, where those folks, not only those folks without power, but those folks who were alone as well. Because we're not built as creatures to be isolated. And I think the church needs to pick up that mantle and continue to be restorative.
We talk every week about just reading scripture in a group, and
doing this,
and what happens? Why some of us are so addicted to Sunday school is because it's a good addiction.
Yes,
there's never anything quite like opening God's Word together and asking questions. I learn something every week thanks to Jamie Plunkett.
I learn so much more from you every single week. I'm sorry that I didn't agree with John Milton.
That's okay.
But I still don't. I'm not backtracking.
You don't have to.
But I still don't.
Have to.
But
you don't have to. Thank you for being honest. We want to remind everybody that we love to hear from you. And here's how you can get in touch with us. And the reading assignment for next week is the 8th chapter of Mark. We will look forward to being back with you again soon. God bless you and keep you.